therein lies the crux of the problem. Are we going to have an energy policy or a transmission policy? It's also interesting talking to some of these electrical engineers that the rates, it depends on the different companies that are very much involved in the economics of power and energy. And they say that one 36-inch pipeline, which we have several of, transmits as much power as 6 500 kV power lines. But more interesting, the line loss and the efficiency is much greater with that. And we have a huge potential here to push the gas through pipelines, to local production of electricity versus trying to push it through power lines and having the loss, the overhead, the magnetic concerns that many residents have as those power lines go through. The good member here from Edmonton earlier asked the question, could we bury these power lines? All of these areas are not being pursued and thought of. And why? Because of a policy that says we need transmission lines. But what we need to do is be able to transmit power. And even on that, let's look at the Northern Lights line from Fort McMurray down to California that's been talked about so much for almost 10 years now. If we put in the pipeline rather than the power line, how much more efficient is that? But as I say, there's just so many areas here that one has to ask, why is the minister insisting that we pass this new Bill 50 so that we can declare that there's a crisis? The sky is falling. We need to immediately address this and build these lines when in fact nothing may happen. It reminds me of 1977, and there's a few in here that will remember that, but the U.S. was talking about converting over to the metric system. And Canada at that point says, oh, we're going to jump on that and be ahead of them and be there. And it cost industry a lot of money to retool our cars and all those things to metric, and the cost to our economy was immense by preempting and saying, oh, we're leading the pack in doing that. And to bury these, or to put these overhead high voltage direct current lines, it's false thinking. Another analogy an engineer gave me, he says, we have $14 billion that he believes will end up being $20 billion that we're going to put into power lines. And he says that's the equivalent, Paul, of going and actually buying copper lines because we want to be able to have a good communication system here in the province, when in fact what we are now is wireless and fiber optics. Why would we do that? If Edison were alive today, he would recognize and understand our grid system because we haven't moved forward to a smart grid. We're not making those decisions. And the most important thing that we need to do is to realize that we need to discuss and debate and look at taxpayers' money. We have $14 billion to $20 billion that they're saying that we need to spend. We need to spend it immediately in order to prevent brownouts and crisis and in order to attract industry here to the province. It's not true. I see the Minister of Energy shaking his head and his finger saying this isn't true, but once you give that mandate, if they're going to build a high voltage line, they're not going to build a little one. It's going to be a big one. The power isn't here. It's going to go ahead. Another part of the flawed system is, though, and again, if we compare to the U.S. and FERCA, their plan there for power, it actually would be illegal to follow the U.S. policy here in Alberta because of our mandate to AESO saying that this is about unconstrained movement of electricity. And so we could have someone like Bruce Power come in and put up a plant in northern Alberta somewhere, and then the taxpayers are responsible for building those lines so they can get the power out. That isn't in our best interest. And the system is wrong. It needs to look at the cost and the benefit of local generation versus long transmission lines. It's not in the policy to address that, and we need to change those things. And so I would urge this government to recognize these shortfalls in Bill 50, that it's not going to serve the interest of Albertans. We don't have the $14 billion to invest now or in the next couple of years on these major transmission lines. We need to focus and realize that electrical generation has changed a great deal. The cost of gas has changed dramatically from 2006 to 2007, and I'll look forward to continuing the debate on Bill 50.
Honourable Minister of Advanced Education and Technology.
29-2.
29-2A.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, please.
Comment.
Just a couple of questions, Mr. Speaker. I was wondering, the honourable member mentioned several times, actually, that there was an immediate cash cost to this program of $14 billion to $20 billion. He tossed a lot of numbers around there. I'm just curious if the honourable member could answer what the cash flow timelines are that he knows of as to what this expenditure is going to be. Is it $14 billion in 2011? Is it $14 billion over 2 years? Is it 3 years? If he could probably enlighten the House with his knowledge of that. The other thing is that he kept talking about that the AESO has a mandate for unconstrained power transmission. And I'm curious where he got that from, because as I recall reading the mandate of AESO, it doesn't say that specifically, and I'm curious. The other thing is he mentioned he mentioned that we're building a bunch of power lines for export to the United States, and I'd be curious to know if he has any documentation or evidence that might be the case, that AESO is somehow involved in that, because AESO is really for the people of Alberta as a not-for-profit. There may be some for-profit guys doing it. And also, when power is exported late at night, I think he said, well, they pay nothing. And actually, I'm understanding that they pay a tariff. I'm curious if you could clarify that for us.
Honourable Member for Calgary-Glenmore.
Well, I thank the honourable member for those questions, and it's quite obvious that he wasn't paying close attention. I'll start with the last one where he says they pay nothing. I actually says they only pay a third, about 1/3 of a dollar to export, because the lines are there. I didn't say they paid nothing. I said they paid a subsidized rate of 66%. The question is that those lines, and again, if we look at the Powering Albertans into the Future put out by AESO, and on the front page this time they've conveniently not put the year of the report, but I believe it's 2008. But when you turn to page 18, I'd be happy to get these copies over to the honourable member. But they talk about the critical transmission infrastructure. And Edmonton to Calgary, $3.1 billion. Heartland, $300 million. Fort McMurray, $2 billion. Southern Alberta, $2 billion. South Calgary, $100 million. Total, $8.1 billion. Additional critical transmission infrastructure, CTI Tier 2, the Northwest, $500 million, the Northeast, $1.4 billion, total $1.9 billion. And then transmission infrastructure under development, bulk transmission system infrastructure currently underway, $570 million. And then we have the cost estimate in 2008 dollars, long-term regional transmission system plan, $3.8 billion, a total of $3.8. And when you add those all up, honourable member, it comes to a little over $14 billion, I believe. And so I'm taking that directly from the AESO website, and the time frame when they're doing that, I don't believe is in this report. But you asked about the question and saying that I said that this was for export. What I said is that many people have asked me to build these huge transmission lines. And again, as human beings, we're supposed to have deductive reasoning. We're able to look and see, well, if we do this, what's the result? Former Premier often referred to that, unintended consequences, or are they intended consequences? To build these huge power lines, it's obvious that it's for sending somewhere else. We don't need that much power here in the province. We're meeting our current needs. 70% of all of the growth in the last 6 years that we've been talking about have been met by backyard generation. And if AESO was to open up, or the Alberta Utilities Commission to be more user-friendly and competitive, you would find that local generation would come forward at a much quicker rate. But we also have to look at the reality of what and where does our energy come from? And it is coming from carbon fuel. And if we look at that, you asked 4 questions, and so I'm trying to answer them all for you. That if you look at that, it's transmitting and moving gas that is far more efficient than electricity. But yet the AESO only focuses and looks on transmitting electricity, which isn't an energy plan on how we're going to reach. And again, I'm going to say what's really important if we want Alberta to return to the Alberta advantage, it's the cost of energy. And if energy is reasonable and competitive on a world basis and on a North American basis, then our industry will be. But if we're going to add $14 billion to the infrastructure for transmission lines when local generation can bring forward, we have to question that.